The house had grown so quiet that even the refrigerator seemed to hum with caution, as if afraid to interrupt the silence that had settled there since Daniel's accident. Julia moved through the rooms with the slow precision of someone trying not to disturb dust that no longer belonged to her. She kept the curtains half closed, not out of preference, but because sunlight had started to feel invasive, like a visitor arriving without permission. Every morning followed the same sequence. She woke before the alarm, stared at the ceiling as the sparrows outside announced another day she didn't want, and forced herself out of bed only when her chest began to ache from staying still too long. She made coffee she rarely drank, cooked oatmeal she barely touched, and left the television on without sound, as if the moving images were enough to mimic company. Her wedding ring remained in a ceramic bowl by the sink, where she had placed it the night she came home from the hospital. It hadn't moved since. Her neighbors waved when they saw her through the window, but she pretended not to notice. She couldn't handle the expressions people wore around the newly widowed. Those soft, pitying smiles, the gentle tilts of the head, the pauses in conversation so long they echoed. They meant well, she knew, but kindness had begun to feel too heavy for her to carry. All she could manage was survival, the next breath, the next hour, the next unremarkable day. On the fourth morning of yet another identical week, she stepped outside to take the trash to the curb. The air was damp from an early drizzle, and the pavement carried the scent of wet soil and old leaves. She walked slowly, shoulders hunched, not only from the cold. At the edge of her driveway, she noticed a shape curled against the base of the streetlight, a dog, thin to the point of translucence, fur matted and patchy, breathing in shallow tremors. Julia froze, gripping the trash bag a little harder. The dog lifted its head weakly, eyes dark and sunken, yet quietly alert. Its ribs moved sharply with each inhale. It didn't bark or whine. It simply watched her with a tired recognition she couldn't explain. She stepped around it carefully, placing the bag into the bin, trying not to get too close. She wasn't ready for anything alive to need her again. When she turned back toward the house, she heard the faint dragging sound of paws following. She stopped. The dog stopped. He waited with patient uncertainty. She exhaled, a long breath that trembled on the way out. Inside the house, she pretended not to look out the window, but the dog remained in the same place by the streetlight, head resting on his paws, motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest. The drizzle returned, a thin mist that clung to everything, but he didn't move for shelter. Part of her wanted to walk out with an umbrella, but even that small act felt like crossing a line she didn't trust herself with. She had failed once. Failed to keep Daniel safe, failed to stop him from driving that night, failed to recognize how tired he was after a shift that ran far too long. The memory hovered constantly, sharp as broken glass. By late afternoon, the dog still hadn't left. Julia found herself drifting toward the window every hour, checking whether he was breathing. When the sky darkened and the temperature dropped, she gave in to the quiet pull in her chest and stepped outside with a small bowl of water. She placed it a few feet from him and stepped back quickly. He didn't rush toward it. He lifted his head slowly, as though uncertain if he deserved the offering, then crawled the short distance and drank with small, careful laps. Julia stood watching, arms crossed, unsure what she was doing or why she was still standing there. That night it rained harder. Wind rattled the gutters, tapping insistently against the siding of her home. She lay awake, picturing the frail body curled beneath the streetlight, drenched and shivering. She told herself he was just a stray, that animal control would eventually pick him up. But another thought crept through, quieter, unsettling. What if he didn't survive until morning? Sleep never came. At dawn, she slipped on her coat and stepped outside. The street was empty except for the glowing line of puddles reflecting the first grey light. The dog was still there, curled in the exact same spot, but he didn't lift his head this time. Panic surged through her chest, sudden and sharp. She approached, kneeling carefully beside him. His eyes opened with effort, and something in the slow blink he gave her felt like a surrender, not to her, but to the moment, to the chance that someone might finally stop walking past. Julia swallowed hard. She slid her hands beneath his thin frame, surprised by how light he was, like lifting an animal made only of bones and soaked fur. He tensed for a second, then went limp against her chest, too weak to resist. Inside the house, she laid him gently on an old towel near the heater. He didn't explore or react to his surroundings. He simply curled in on himself, conserving what little energy remained. Julia warmed a small bowl of broth and set it beside him. He sniffed it, hesitated, then drank in slow intervals. For the rest of the day, she stayed near him without meaning to, moving through the room in quiet loops. She swept the floor, wiped the counters, reorganized shelves that didn't need reorganizing, anything to stay close without admitting she was staying close. Every now and then, the dog opened his eyes, tracking her with small movements, as though making sure she hadn't disappeared. She kept him at a distance emotionally, or at least she tried to. She reminded herself he would have to go to a shelter once he was strong enough. She wasn't fit for responsibility, not anymore. Not after Daniel, not after the night she should have insisted he rest instead of driving. She had told him he'd be fine. She had believed it, wanted to believe it. Now the echo of that certainty haunted her more than the crash itself. As evening approached, the dog attempted to stand. His legs trembled under his weight, and he nearly collapsed back onto the towel. Julia's chest tightened. She crouched beside him, steadying his body with both hands. He leaned into her unconsciously, not as affection, but necessity, using her presence as support. It was the smallest contact, hardly more than the weight of his ribs against her palms. But something shifted inside her, a crack in the thick layer of numbness she had worn since the funeral. She stood up abruptly, startled by the sensation, and stepped away. The dog sank back down, exhausted. Julia paced the room twice, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't ready for this. She had spent months avoiding anything that reminded her she was still capable of feeling. Allowing something fragile into her life felt like a betrayal to the grief she still clung to. But when she finally stopped pacing and glanced toward the heater, the dog looked back at her with a simple, unguarded presence. Not asking, not demanding, just there. And for the first time in a long while, the silence in the house felt slightly less sharp. The next morning began with a stillness that felt different from the usual emptiness of the house. Julia woke with a faint sense of awareness beside her bed, as though the air itself had changed shape overnight. She sat up slowly, listening. The heater hummed softly from the living room, and beneath it came the faint shuffle of movement. Not energetic, just a tired shifting of weight, the kind that signaled the dog was still fighting to remain part of the world. She wrapped herself in her robe and walked down the hallway. The dog lay curled on the towel, his nose tucked close to his hind leg, chest rising and falling with a steadier rhythm than the day before. When Julia approached, his ears twitched, and he lifted his gaze just enough to acknowledge her. She placed a small bowl of soft food beside him. He hesitated before eating, as if unsure he was allowed to accept the offering again. When he finally began to chew, she watched his movements, slow, deliberate, careful. Every swallow felt like a small victory for a creature so worn down by the streets. The morning light pressed through the curtains, illuminating the living room in muted gold. Dust floated lazily in the air, shifting with every step she took. Julia sat on the edge of the couch, arms wrapped around herself, trying to ignore the way the room felt less hostile with another breathing thing inside it. She wasn't used to it anymore. It had been months since she'd shared space with anything living. Months since the house had held warmth that didn't come from the heater. The dog finished eating and attempted again to stand. His legs wobbled helplessly beneath him. He managed one uneven step before sliding back onto the towel, Julia moved quickly, kneeling to steady him. Her hands hovered for a second, but instinct pushed her to support his fragile frame once more. He didn't resist. He leaned into her again, the same instinctive trust as before. As though her presence had become part of the floor, he needed to stay upright. Julia felt that small crack inside her widen, not painfully this time, but with a quiet ache that reminded her she was still human, still capable of offering something without breaking. She eased him back down, adjusting the towel around him. As she worked, she noticed the scars along his legs, old ones, healed unevenly, likely from fights or accidents. Life on the street rarely spared gentler animals. He must have spent months wandering alone, surviving on scraps and luck, sleeping in corners people pretended not to see. Something about that mirrored her own existence too closely. By mid-morning, she realized she was avoiding the kitchen. Not because she wasn't hungry, but because the space still carried the memory of Daniel's routines. He used to whistle while making breakfast, something simple, tuneless, repetitive, but comforting. Now the room felt like a museum of things she didn't know how to touch anymore. So she stayed near the dog, folding and refolding a blanket, cleaning spots already clean, finding excuses to linger where the weight in her chest felt slightly less suffocating. At noon, she sat by the window watching the quiet street. Leaves drifted lazily along the asphalt, pushed by a soft breeze. The world outside moved at its own uncaring pace. People walked dogs, children biked past, cars hummed by. Life continued, indifferent to her grief. The dog stirred, drawing her attention. He pushed himself upright, trembling with the effort, but managing to stay seated this time. His gaze drifted toward the front door, not with excitement, but with a faint instinct to go somewhere, anywhere other than the small tower that defined his world. "You can't," she whispered internally, though the words never left her throat. He was too weak, too thin. If she opened the door, he'd collapse on the porch within minutes. Still, he watched the door, breathing shallowly, and something in the gesture tugged at her. A creature who had known nothing but wandering was trying to understand stillness. And she, who had known nothing but stillness lately, was trying to understand movement again. Eventually he curled back down, exhausted from even that brief moment of wanting. Julia remained seated, unsure what to do with the feeling spreading through her. It wasn't affection yet. It wasn't a bond. It was something quieter, an unspoken agreement that they were two damaged beings sharing an uncomfortable peace. By late afternoon, she moved him closer to the window, placing the towel where a patch of pale sunlight warmed the floor. He sank into it gratefully, eyes half closing as the warmth seeped through his thin fur. Julia watched him from the armchair, knees drawn to her chest, thinking about how Daniel used to nap in that same spot on weekends. He'd fall asleep with a book on his chest, head tilted awkwardly, insisting he wasn't tired whenever she nudged him awake. The dog shifted in his sleep, a soft twitch of his paw. Julia's breath caught. It wasn't the resemblance to Daniel's position that struck her. It was the quiet weight of memory pressing into the present, something she had avoided for so long she had almost forgotten how to feel it. The overlap between past and present landed gently this time, rather than like a blow. She remained in the chair until dusk, watching the sky bleed into darker shades. When night approached, she brought the dog a deeper blanket, tucking it around him with hesitant hands. He blinked up at her once, long and slow, before resting his head again. The room dimmed, and the house felt somehow different, still quiet, still heavy, but no longer empty in the same punishing way. Julia turned off the lamp and stood in the dark, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow from the street. She hesitated for a long moment, listening to the soft breaths coming from the floor. She realized she wasn't afraid of the silence tonight. Not entirely. She walked to her bedroom, pausing at the doorway to look back once more. The dog didn't move, but his presence lingered in the air like a fragile anchor holding her in place. For the first time in months, she closed her bedroom door gently, instead of letting it fall shut behind her. The house remained quiet, but the quiet had changed shape. Julia woke before dawn again, but this time the silence in the house felt less like an intruder and more like a presence waiting patiently beside her. She slipped out of bed and walked toward the living room, her footsteps soft against the floorboards. A faint rustling answered her approach. The dog lifted his head as she entered, blinking slowly, as though piecing together the memory of where he was. She knelt beside him, checking the blanket. It had shifted during the night, exposing part of his thin back. She adjusted it carefully, tugging the edges around him the way she once used to cover Daniel when he fell asleep on the couch. The movement startled her. Her breath snagged in her chest, and she froze, but the dog didn't react to the weight of her hands or the pause that followed. He simply lay there, accepting the warmth without question. Julia inhaled deeply and stood, shaking off the heaviness that threatened to pull her down. She went to the kitchen, made herself tea instead of coffee, and for once didn't turn on the television. The quiet felt manageable, not comfortable, but survivable. When she returned to the living room with her mug, the dog was attempting to sit up again. His progress was still slow, but no longer desperate. He held himself upright long enough for Julia to notice that his breathing sounded steadier today. She placed another bowl of softened food in front of him, and he ate more willingly, pausing only to lift his gaze toward her every few bites. Not expectant, just aware. After he finished, he pushed his nose weakly toward the towel, shifting in a way that suggested he needed more space. Julia understood the gesture without thinking. She gently helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight. He leaned on her as they moved a few inches, enough for him to turn and settle again. It wasn't a walk, not even close, but it was movement. A small act of trying. She sat on the floor beside him, legs crossed, holding the warm mug between her palms. The house settled around them. The heater clicked. A distant car passed by. Their two breaths, uneven in different ways, filled the space between them. Around mid-morning, Julia decided to step outside for fresh air. She cracked the door to check the weather. Cloudy, cool, a dull light casting everything in shades of grey. When she turned to grab a sweater, she heard a faint scrape. The dog had dragged himself closer to the door, his body angled toward her departure. Julia froze. He wasn't strong enough to stand. He wasn't begging. It was simply instinct. An animal who had spent months following scraps of movement in search of safety, now responding to her the same way. "I'm just going outside," she thought, though the words stayed silent. She hadn't spoken aloud in days, maybe weeks. She wasn't sure anymore. She stepped out for only a minute, inhaling the crisp air. When she returned inside, the dog was still in the same place, still watching, still waiting. She closed the door quietly, unsure why the sight of him there tightened something behind her ribs. The rest of the day passed in careful fragments. Julia cleaned the living room again, more thoroughly this time. She shook out old blankets, swept corners she usually ignored, wiped down the coffee table until the wood shone slightly under the dim light. She told herself it was because the dog needed a clean environment, but suspected it had more to do with the sudden restlessness she felt. Movement kept her from thinking too deeply. She kept checking on him, even when she tried not to. A glance every few minutes, a pause to assess his breathing. When he shifted positions, she adjusted the blanket. When he whined softly in discomfort, she brought him water. When he managed 3 shaky steps toward the window, she steadied him with her hands. He followed her movements with quiet, steady eyes, never demanding, never insisting, simply tracking her presence as if it mattered. In the late afternoon, she opened the curtains wider. Light filtered into the room, revealing how thin the dog truly was. His fur, when touched by sunlight, showed the uneven patches where skin had been exposed too long to the cold. Julia looked at him and felt a slow, creeping guilt. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because something fragile had entered her home, and she wasn't sure she deserved to care for it. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the floor. Julia sat again on the armchair, watching the dog breathe. She hadn't realized how much time had passed until the room had dimmed into a soft blue-gray. Her eyes drifted to the mantel. A framed photo of Daniel still sat there. A picture taken 2 summers before the accident, when they'd gone hiking near the coast. He was smiling, squinting against the wind, hair tousled, cheeks sunburned. She hadn't looked directly at that photo in months. Whenever her gaze approached it, she pulled away, unable to withstand the sudden rush of memory. Tonight, she didn't look away immediately. The ache came, sharp and deep, but it didn't knock her breath out like it used to. Maybe because the dog shifted at the same moment, lifting his head to adjust his position, grounding her back in the present. Later, when the sky had turned fully dark, Julia moved the dog's towel closer to the couch. She hesitated before helping him stand, afraid of hurting him, but he leaned gently into her hands, as though guiding her through the motion. Once he was settled again, she sat on the floor instead of the chair. They stayed like that, sharing the dim room in heavy silence. She didn't know how long she remained there before exhaustion finally pulled her up. She stretched her stiff back, turned off the lamp, and stood at the doorway of her bedroom. She glanced back. The dog's eyes were half open, reflecting the faint streetlight seeping through the window. He wasn't watching her. Not exactly, but he was aware she was there. Julia stepped into her room and closed the door softly again. A small act, but different from the night before. This time, the quiet didn't feel like a wall pressing in. It felt like a beginning she didn't yet understand. The 4th morning arrived with a thin fog clinging to the street, muffling the world outside Julia's window. She stepped into the living room and found the dog already awake, lying exactly where she had left him, but with his head raised, as if he had been waiting for her. His eyes held a calm awareness she hadn't expected. Not energy, just a steady presence, a simple acknowledgement that she had returned. She brought him food. He ate more today, still slowly, but with a quiet determination that made her pause. When he finished, he shifted as though preparing to stand. Julia moved closer, offering support without thinking. His legs trembled, but he managed to balance longer than before. They took 3 steps together, small, uneven, but undeniably steps. Afterward, he rested again, breathing harder from the effort. Julia crouched beside him, her hand hovering close to his back, feeling the leftover tremors that ran through him. Something about his persistence stirred a sensation she hadn't felt in months, a faint recognition of movement, of life insisting on continuing even when the body resisted. As she stood, her gaze drifted again to the photo of Daniel on the mantel. It was becoming harder to ignore. Every time she looked at the dog, every time she steadied his fragile weight, every time she adjusted his blanket or cleaned his bowl, there was a faint echo of the night she didn't want to remember. Daniel slumped at the kitchen table after a long shift, his eyes tired, voice hoarse, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. He kept denying. She had noticed. She had seen the way he kept rubbing his temples, the way he blinked too long when he tried to focus. But he had insisted he could drive back to work for one last errand. He had said it would take only 15 minutes. She had believed him because she wanted the evening to stay normal, because she trusted his confidence more than her own unease. She remembered walking him to the door, thinking he would be fine, the flash of taillights fading into the dark, the phone call an hour later, the world collapsing before she could understand what the voice on the other end was saying. Now, as she looked at the dog resting on her living room floor, she felt the ache settling into her sternum again, the same weight she carried every day, the one she had mistaken for permanence. The dog stirred, breaking the spiral before it could pull her under. He lifted his head and nudged the edge of his towel with his nose, pushing it toward the coffee table. Julia frowned slightly, then knelt to adjust it for him. But he nudged again, a subtle push, not toward her but toward something beyond her. She followed the direction of his movement with her eyes. His nose landed on a small wooden box sitting on the bottom shelf of the table, a box she hadn't opened since the funeral. Inside were items she kept meaning to sort through but never could. Daniel's watch, his wallet, the keychain he always carried, the note he'd written on her birthday months before he died. For a moment, the room tightened around her. She felt faint, unready for the wave that threatened to rise. The dog wasn't pointing at the box. He couldn't have understood what it contained. He was simply shifting, seeking comfort, nudging whatever object was closest to him. But the coincidence pressed a raw nerve. Julia stepped back, the heaviness crawling up her throat. She turned away and walked to the kitchen, trying to steady her breath. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. The house felt suddenly too small, too full of memories she'd tried to seal behind doors and drawers. A few minutes passed before she returned to the living room. The dog had laid his head near the wooden box, as if using it as an anchor. His breathing was slow, calm, unaware of the storm he had stirred in her. Julia sat on the couch, staring at the box from across the room. The dog lifted his eyes to her, then closed them again, settling into sleep. That simple act, trusting the space, trusting her proximity, made something inside her soften enough that she didn't get up and leave the room. As the day went on, she found herself cleaning again. Not out of restlessness this time, but from a strange need to make the house less suffocating. She opened windows for the first time in months, letting crisp air flow through the rooms. She dusted the shelves, wiped the counters, swept beneath the couch. The dog watched her, shifting occasionally to keep her in his line of sight. His eyes followed her quietly, grounding her movements in a way she didn't understand. She wasn't sure whether he was still too weak to relax or simply unwilling to let her drift too far. His gaze wasn't clingy, just present, like a shadow that offered warmth instead of darkness. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted, revealing a muted winter sun. Julia helped the dog stand again. This time he remained upright longer, wobbling but determined. He even took a few steps toward the front door. She steadied him, watching the way he pressed his weight against her arm. His ribs touched her gently, but with enough insistence to remind her that he needed support, and that she could still provide it. When he grew tired, he curled in a patch of sunlight near the window. Julia sat on the armchair, feeling her heartbeat calm as she watched him breathe. The house felt fuller, anchored by a soft, steady presence that had nothing to do with the past. But the box still sat beneath the coffee table, the wooden edges catching the fading light. As dusk settled, Julia found herself drawn to it. The dog was asleep, his breath slow and even. She reached down, fingertips brushing the lid. It felt as heavy as a stone, even though she knew it weighed almost nothing. She didn't open it, but she didn't push it back under the table either. She left it where it was, visible, reachable, waiting. When night arrived, she moved the dog slightly closer to the heater. His body curled naturally toward the warmth, his back rising and falling with a rhythm that soothed something deep inside her. Julia stood watching him longer than she meant to, the room dim around them. Before going to bed, she paused at the doorway, letting the silence settle. The wooden box still glowed faintly beneath the table. The dog's breathing filled the space with a gentle constancy. For the first time, she felt the edges of a truth she had been avoiding for months, a truth she wasn't ready to face, but no longer able to hide from entirely. She closed her bedroom door softly, leaving it slightly ajar this time, as if admitting that the night didn't need to swallow everything whole. Julia woke before sunrise, but unlike the other mornings, she didn't linger in bed. A quiet pull guided her into the living room, where the first faint line of daylight spilled across the floor. The dog lay curled near the heater, still asleep, chest rising with a steadier rhythm than when he had first arrived. His fur caught the pale light, revealing new softness where the skin had looked sharp days before. Julia stood there for a long moment, letting the stillness settle around her. Something in the air felt different, lighter, but also fragile, like a thin sheet of ice that might crack under the wrong breath. She made tea, warm and mild, and sat on the floor beside him as he stirred awake. His ears twitched, then he lifted his head slowly and looked at her. There was no expectation in his gaze, only recognition, not of ownership or dependence, just presence. He shifted closer, resting his chin on the blanket. Julia reached out and let her hand hover above his fur before finally resting it gently on his back. The contact was soft, cautious, but he leaned into it. A quiet exhale escaped her, so small she barely heard it herself. As the room brightened, her eyes drifted toward the wooden box on the lower shelf of the coffee table. It remained where she had left it, no longer hidden, no longer buried beneath stacks of untouched magazines and dust. It sat exposed, an object she had spent months avoiding, even in her periphery. She didn't move toward it at first. She simply stared, her hand still resting on the dog's side, feeling his breathing settle into a calm, grounding rhythm beneath her palm. Eventually, the weight inside her shifted, not painfully, but with a gentle insistence. Julia stood slowly, leaving her tea and the dog where they were, and crossed the room. Her fingers trembled as they reached for the box. The air felt tighter, heavier, as though the house itself held its breath. She sat on the couch, the box in her lap. Her thumb traced the small scratch on the lid, one she remembered Daniel had made during a move years ago. They had laughed about how he managed to scratch everything he touched. She hadn't thought about that moment since the funeral. She lifted the lid. Inside lay the small collection of things she had gathered the night she returned from the hospital, unable to face them, but unwilling to let them go. Daniel's wristwatch lay on top, the face cracked from a fall months before the accident. Beneath it was his wallet, still containing the faded photo of them, taken on their first anniversary. The ink had lightened, but their smiles were still visible, hers wide, his crooked. She swallowed, her breath catching as she picked up the watch. It felt cold, delicate, too delicate for the man who used to wear it. A wave of guilt washed through her, sudden and sharp. She closed her eyes, remembering the night he left for that final errand. How tired he had been. How she had brushed off her concern, telling herself he knew his limits better than she did. The guilt that had lived inside her since that moment rose again, familiar and suffocating. But as she tightened her grip on the watch, something warm pressed against her leg. She opened her eyes. The dog had stood, trembling but upright, and walked toward her. She hadn't heard him move. He lowered his head, nudging her knee gently before sinking to the floor beside her. He lay there without moving, his breath slow and even, anchoring her to the present. Julia placed the watch back in the box and closed her eyes. The tightness in her chest didn't vanish, but it softened enough for her to draw a steady breath. She set the box down on the couch beside her, letting it rest there instead of hiding it away again. The dog shifted, resting his head on her foot. The contact was light, instinctive, and strangely steadying. She looked down at him, noticing how much healthier he seemed already, still thin, still weak, but no longer on the edge of collapse. His ribs didn't show as sharply, his breathing no longer rasped. She reached down and touched his shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath her fingertips. He closed his eyes, leaning into the gesture without hesitation. For the first time since Daniel's death, the house didn't feel like a monument to loss. It felt lived in, imperfect, quiet, human. The dog's presence didn't erase the grief. It simply made room for it to breathe. As the sun rose, spilling pale gold across the room, Julia finally allowed herself to revisit the memory of that night. Not the crash, not the phone call, just the moment she had watched Daniel walk out the door, exhausted and determined. She remembered the faltering smile he had given her, the one that said he'd be fine even when he wasn't. She had carried the weight of that smile like a punishment. But now, holding the memory gently instead of bracing against it, she realized something she had avoided for months. She had done what she could with what she knew. She had loved him. She had trusted him. And he had made a choice he believed he could manage. Her fault hadn't been inaction. It had been the belief that she should have been able to rewrite the past. The dog stirred again, as if feeling the shift in her breathing. He nudged his head against her foot once more, grounding her in the moment she was finally allowing herself to inhabit. Julia placed the wooden box on the coffee table and let her hand fall to her lap. She sat there with the dog leaning against her, the quiet morning settling gently across the room. She didn't smile. Not fully, but the tightness behind her ribs eased, and the ever-present ache became something she could carry without collapsing. When she stood, the dog attempted to rise with her. She steadied him, letting him lean into her side. They walked slowly together toward the window, where the winter light spread across the floor. He lowered himself onto the warm patch, curling with familiar softness. Julia stood beside him, watching the quiet street beyond the glass. She didn't know what the coming days would look like, whether she'd keep him permanently, whether he would recover fully, whether the weight of the past would settle again. But for now, the house no longer felt like a sealed room full of ghosts. It felt like a place where breathing was allowed. She knelt once more and rested her hand on the dog's back, letting the warmth of his body anchor her in the present. And in the soft quiet of that morning, she understood, not with certainty, but with acceptance, that she was still here, still capable of staying, still capable of beginning again in small, imperfect steps. If this story touched you, consider subscribing for more human-animal journeys like this.